But it turns out that the National Bank of Washington had a small foreign operation in the Bahamas. It had $37 million worth of worth of deposits. Now those deposits, because it's a foreign bank, are completely uninsured. What's more, Frank, the bank is in the Bahamas, which means that all of its records are secret. Okay, now this is a bank from Washington, D.C. It seems to be controlled by some Saudi Arabians and some Washington politicians. So now it has to be bailed out, but the foreign branch in the Bahamas didn't have to be bailed out. The FDIC staff recommended that the depositors be left basically hanging, since they didn't even know who they were. But William Seidman overruled his staff and gave money to ordered the FDIC to give money to the bank which took over the National Bank of Washington, called Riggs, and they paid off their insured depositors. Their uninsured depositors, I'm sorry, in the Bahamas. Kenneth Gunther, who runs the Independent Bankers Association of America, wrote a letter to the FDIC asking for an explanation of how the agency could justify taking money from this country's bankers, because they pay those premiums as insurance, and give it to uninsured depositors in Bahamian Bank. Well, the FDIC responded that approximately 51% of the deposits in the 9 largest American banks were in foreign branches. And it was believed that negative repercussions, to quote, negative repercussions would have been felt by these money center banks if the Nassau deposits were not included in the insurance. And they were afraid of the confusion in the international markets that would have been created by such a decision. Well, Mayer points out that this is a pretty ridiculous explanation when you come right down to it, because what it implies is what happens in this tiny $37 million in assets branch of a bank in the Bahamas would affect the 9 largest money center banks in the country. But that's the rationale that the FDIC gave for paying off these unknown and uninsured deposits.
Next on Alternative Views on our potpourri, we go back and take another look at corporate treason during and before World War II, when the major U.S. corporations and banks were assisting the Axis powers, our enemy. There's a great documentary called America from Hitler to MX, made by Joan Harvey. It has a section on this subject of corporate treason.
The First World War and then the Second World War, American business industrialists supported Germany's rearmament, supported Hitler and his rise. I wonder if the young German knew just how much American industrial capital went into building Germany to fight the Second World War.
The general says that the big capital, trusts, the big trusts, the capital, the big money, has no conscience and acts in unscrupulous ways.
Recently, I discovered that, just as in my youth, growing up in a fascist country, the government's exaggeration of the threat from the East makes a rationale for fascism. And this picture of a communist Eastern world, which supposedly is only waiting to attack the free peoples and suppress them, was drawn to legitimize their own preparations for war.
Right before the war, the corporate heads of Ford and Esso and DuPont transferred ownership and management to the German government. And then we got into the war full scale, and then after the war, the management was transferred back to these corporations, and if by accident one of these factories was bombed, war reparations were paid to these U.S. corporations, usually by the United States government. They won both ways.
It is known that German industry, Krupp and other large German concerns helped Hitler come to power in the expectation that they were thereby erecting a bulwark against Bolshevism, and also to improve their situation through the armaments business. To what extent these firms were influenced by even larger American capital in the background, about that there are not very clear opinions in Germany.
In 1936, there was a munitions hearing by the United States Senate to indict Lockheed, DuPont, Electric Boat, who makes all the submarines, DuPont because of their buildup of trucks and cars in the Nazi regime. Let me not leave out Rockefeller. That is, we were rearming Germany to fight the United States.
It became clear after the war that the situation of supranational interests, for example, led to the fact that certain industries were not attacked in Germany, that had actually been of great importance to the war economy, and therefore should have been primary targets. This shows that the interests of finance capital are effective beyond the borders of warring nations, and thereby represent uncontrollable and sinister powers that have to be destroyed in the interests of the peoples.
During the bombings in the Second World War, which industries, which factories were not touched by bombs from either side?
IG Farben, as you say, but I don't know whether IG Farben plants were not also destroyed somewhere. General Motors, Opel, Ford. There will also be proof of the opposite. But in the grand total, it will be true that plants that were backed by American capital were struck less than others.
I toured the Ford plant in Cologne in '71. And this place was built like in the 30s. The place was never damaged during the war. It was never bombed.
But it is not known that American finance capital supported the arming of Hitler before World War II, and thereby made it possible.
The testimony by the senators was their outrage at the collusion between the American businessmen and IG Farben and some of the businesses, high businesses in Europe to rearm Germany.
U.S. corporations like Ford and DuPont, Esso, which is now Exxon Nuclear, these corporations were real active in help building the German war machine during the 1930s. Their influence and the technology they provided can't be underestimated. The German government gave them medals.
Hitler awarded one of the DuPont people in GM with a medal during the 30s, and then Ford was given some award by Hitler for their participation in the effort to rearm Hitler. And
for Hitler, it was more a matter of tactics. He noticed, of course, that with the anti-Bolshevik propaganda, he received the support he needed from the conservative industrial middle class, for example.
I know the average American doesn't know just what dangers they were to the people. You see, America's God is not almighty God, it's almighty dollar. You just, well, put that down in black and white. But you get these warlords and money kings up on top, that's where your trouble comes from. And they're always going to be together on the dollar. The dollar is what causes all the trouble.
One of the things that's scary as hell to me is that I think people don't even know the corporate interests that you were talking about supported, are the same damn ones that supported Hitler in the Second World War, you know? And then go on to support the suppression of oil and the building up of nuclear interests. And now they support Reagan, and they are making the defense money.
Yeah, it was amazing to me, and you know, I mean, I consider myself fairly well informed. You know, I went to school and learned a few things. But when this whole thing came out about one of the big corporations, I should not name the wrong one, and I can't remember the name, but one of the big aircraft corporations building Focke-Wulfs for Hitler at the same time they were building P-38s or whatever it was for the American Air Force, you know, couldn't lose because they had money invested on both sides. And, you know, that whole thing, I mean, in terms of theory, it always made sense, but to hear the hard practical facts, I think really wakes people up, and I think that information has to get out. The fact that, you know, corporate interests know no boundaries.
It was pretty obvious that many of our own corporations in this country provided essential aid to the Axis forces in the Second World War, and many of the technological improvements that led to many of the early victories of the Nazis in Europe and to the death of the working class in this country were the direct result of our multinational corporations selling technological secrets to the Axis forces through neutral countries such as Switzerland.
The names that I know that brought into the Nazis during the Second World War were DuPont, Rockefeller, Morgan, Ford.
Rings a bell, yeah. A lot of them, most of them.
And that's scary, because those are the interests that we know today.
It is incontrovertible fact, and has been historically ascertained, that all of industry, represented also by their central organizations, tolerated Hitler's seizure of power, and that they financially strongly supported him in his election battles before he came to power, and that they had the expectation that now the armaments industry would get a fresh start, and simultaneously a bulwark would be erected against communism.
In the United States, the industrialists in business with Farben and Krupp in rebuilding Germany remain the people who have the contracts today in the United States for weapons. The main Savannah River plant for weapons is run by DuPont. In Hanford, the other major weapons center is run today by DuPont, Westinghouse, and General Electric, all of whom were supporters of Hitler. The United States industry of arms remains in private hands, and the same ownership supported Hitler.
In Germany, there were, after the war crimes trials of leading men of the armaments industry who were found guilty, and some received huge penalties. But this did not change anything. The system remained the same, especially the international connections of the large cartels and large concerns and high finance. They are effective as before and create a situation in which the interest in more armaments, increased orders, increased profits are brutally placed above the interest of the peoples in disarmament and peace and peaceful coexistence.
Now to go back to a lower level of high finance. Now you dug deeply into this Silverado thing. And did you tell us about E. Trine Starnes Jr. in the past? Oh, there's a new one on you. Okay, The Guardian has a story by Jack Calhoun. There's a E. Trine Starnes Jr. He was a big freewheeling real estate tycoon in the 80s. He had 175 real estate companies, and he kept them afloat with $500 million in loans, which, but like so happened, he defaulted, and on more than a dozen loans. But what is interesting about Starnes, you know, he was involved with he comes up with a documentation of linking him and the Nicaraguan Contras, along with Silverado.
Really?
He was Starnes was a major donor to this organization set up by Oliver North called National Endowment for Preservation of Liberty, or NEPL. He gave $30,000 to this. Now, in addition to all this money that he got from Silverado, all these loans were made despite the fact that Silverado had no previous experience with Starnes, and that Starnes had a previous history of financial instability. but he liked the Contras, right? And so did George Bush. George Bush, of course, was running this whole affair in the vice president's office. His office is right next door to Oliver North, and they were in contact a lot.
Donald Gregg.
Yeah, Donald Gregg was in George Bush's office coordinating another illegal activity of drugs and funding for the Contras. Well, although this NEPL, the National Endowment for Preservation of Liberty, is supposed to be a private group, Oliver North lists as an integral part of the Enterprise, which was the name of the channel for illegal arms that were being sent to the Contras after Congress banned the U.S. military involvement. Now, there's another link of Starnes and that NEPL organization, and it ties in with the intelligence community and, well, I'll save the best for the last.
Okay.
Anyway, there's a connection with Palmer National Bank in Washington, D.C. That's where this endowment, NEPL, did its banking. Well, documents from the National Security Archives indicate that 4 accounts had ties to George Bush and the intelligence community, according to Pete Bruton of the Houston Post, who's been doing investigative reporting on this. Bruton revealed that Palmer National was started in 1983 by a couple of guys, one named Stephen Halper and Harvey McLean, Jr. Now, these guys are former operatives in Bush's unsuccessful campaign for 1980 to try to grab the presidency. Halper has ties with the intelligence community and later became a big dog in the Reagan-Bush administration, the State Department's Bureau of Political Affairs. He was head of that. And McLean was a business associate of Herman Beebe.
Well, who else?
Convicted Louisiana mobster who provided Palmer National with a majority of its initial capitalization. Now, I heard Pete Bruton on a talk show a week or so ago, and he was saying that the investigations by Congress and elsewhere are just whitewashing this SNL stuff. They're not looking into the real structure, particularly like showing how Beebe, this mobster, has control of many of the SNLs all over the Southwest particularly.
The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in 1985 did a study on Herman Beebe to determine the extent of his influence. And they determined that he controlled absolutely or strongly influenced 169 banks in this country. Banks and thrifts.
All over, not just the Southwest then.
Mostly in the Southwest. Lots of Texas banks, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas. And of course, he lives in Louisiana. He started in Louisiana.
Better not show this program in New Orleans.
Well, he started in the bayous, Cajun country, and he started by selling insurance through banks. So in other words, every lender that came in had to buy insurance. Had to buy insurance for his life so that in case he died, the loan would be paid off. Any developers had to buy insurance for all of their employees, and so forth. So it was just a perfect captive market for the insurance industry. His main company was called AMI. You may have heard of it. It was in the early 80s, it was a real winner on Wall Street. Hundreds of millions of dollars.
This is a point that some people who've studied the mafia over the years say now the mafia is so integrated and entangled with so-called clean business or legal business that it's hard to tell the difference anymore. And even shares of some of the key mafia corporations are traded on the stock exchange in New York.
Beebe has been a friend and associate of Carlos Marcello, who's the head mobster of New Orleans. Has been for 20 years. He's been in jail for last 10, I guess. But they've been close friends for 20 years. Beebe was a hero to many of the SNL slime bags In fact, he started Vernon Savings and Loan, Don Dixon. He got Don Dixon in business. And a guy named Terrell Barker, who was also a friend of Dixon's. They were like sons to Herman Beebe.
And Dixon was a guy who had Vernon Savings
and Loan.
Dallas, whose feet are on the fire now.
Yeah, he's probably the slimiest of them all. I've just been reading a book called The Biggest Bank Robbery in History by a guy named Martin Mayer, who's a writer, an expert in banking. And he's an insider. And he tells the story of the savings and loan crisis from the other side, the Wall Street side. All of those mortgages that, those bad mortgages that the savings and loans gave out in the early 80s that eventually defaulted, well, they were all sold on secondary markets. I mean, there were suddenly billions and billions and billions of extra dollars floating around, and all the guys on Wall Street, all the traders were selling things back and forth and taking their cut on each transaction. I mean, they made a fortune. They made a killing.
So this savings and loan thing isn't just one level of activity, but it's all integrated in with the big banks and...
The big banks, the Wall Street investment banks, like Merrill Lynch, Salomon Brothers, Prudential Bach, Goldman. Right. That's where the money was made. I mean, these SNL guys were out here. They were small potatoes. They're letting them hang now. I mean.
And the big guys up there who really raked it.
Sure, they just raked it in.
And,
of course.
And they don't have any liability on this?
No, of course. Wow. Yeah.
Now let's do an update on the story we did on food irradiation some time ago with Dr. James Ebert. For those who didn't see the program, can you tell me briefly just again what food irradiation is, what their plans are?
Yes, food irradiation, Frank, is a technology whereby food destined for human consumption is exposed to ionizing radiation for the stated purpose of sterilization and pasteurization.
So what happens then to the food?
Well, the ionizing gamma radiation alters the food. It kills, it sterilizes anything that happens to be on the food, but it also alters the molecular components of the food, thereby deteriorating the quality of the food.
Well, this sounds like it could destroy the, the food value.
Oh yes, it deteriorates the
vitamins, minerals, and amino acids and all that.
Correct.
Well, then why are they doing it?
Well, they're saying it as a preservative.
Oh.
To extend shelf life. You can get a few extra days of shelf life on some strawberries, for example. Or you can sterilize some meat so that you can eat it 5 years from now if you don't expose it to air after the exposure period.
I saw, I think it was on CNN or somewhere, they're saying that they're starting to build these plants now somewhere?
Well, back in May of this year, 1990, the FDA finally approved the irradiation technology for use on poultry. The industry, some people in the industry had been petitioning the FDA for some time to allow this, and now the FDA has given a go-ahead to do it.
And only poultry, but they eventually have plans to do a lot more food than that.
Well, they're taking it step by step. Initially, a couple of years ago, they got fresh fruits and vegetables, and now they're going for poultry, and now they're still petitioning for pork, as I understand. They'll be going for beef next, just chewing away little bits of pieces.
Have they actually built any of these plants yet?
Well, it's interesting you should ask. Down in Florida, in a little town, Mulberry, Florida, they're building a irradiation plant for the express purpose of food irradiation. And what they intend to use in this plant is cesium-137, which is a gamma radiation source, and cesium is a byproduct of plutonium manufacture. So the DOE, the Department of Energy here in this country, has mountains of the cesium-137 that they would like to see in a food irradiation facility, because then it will be out of their storage facility, a little less for them to inventory and maintain that way. and this company is called Vindicators. And,
oh, God.
How's that for a name?
Yeah.
So they're building this facility for the express purpose of poultry irradiation and fresh fruits and vegetables. And initially they're going to go after the citrus market, irradiating oranges and grapefruits to give them a little extra shelf life.
Now, when our first program we were talking about that there were some studies that indicated that there were also harmful effects from not only just destroying the food value, the nutritional value of the food, but also some harmful effects. Have there been any more?
Well, there's, whenever you irradiate food source or food stuff, if you will, you produce what are called unique radiolytic byproducts. And the word has been ballyhooed about, but what happens is there are molecules that are altered for the experience of the radiation into things that they don't know what they are. And it's not that they're unknown to science, but it's just like if you were to hit the billiard balls on your pool table, you don't know in which direction they're going to travel. And so as a result, when you slam the molecule of food with a particle, a gamma particle, it shatters that molecule and the ones around it, and they have a tendency to rearrange into things that aren't necessarily for our benefit. And any living entity that happens to be on the food is automatically killed, and any bacteria, that is. And so the food is in fact sterilized. And things like potatoes, for example, that go on to seance, what they call seance, and what we call sprouting, or after a while, that seancing is killed. In other words, potatoes will not sprout after they've been irradiated.
Gosh.
Onions and...
Now, they eventually plan to build about 1,000 of these plants all around the country, as I understand, which means that they're going to be trucking all this radioactive stuff here and there.
Back during the Reagan administration, they were really ballyhooing this, and they had really had their plans and their ideals set on maybe 1,000, 2,000 of these plants around the country so that they wouldn't have to go so far with the foods, because we are dealing with a perishable commodity, even with the irradiation idea. Since the Reagan administration has passed, the interest in food irradiation has dwindled quite a bit. It hasn't died, just has come down quite a bit, interest level, that is. But this Vindicators, they seem to be really gung-ho to build this facility. And it's really interesting to notice, Frank, that in Florida, the state of Florida, in their constitution, has a provision that supersedes the rights of the community in this matter. In other words, a community like Mulberry cannot pass an ordinance against having a irradiation facility in their community. And the citizens of Mulberry would like not to have this facility. And they've done everything they could. They even took it to court, and the judge said, Constitution says, like, you can't do anything. And this brings up an extremely important point that I'd like to make, and that is the consumer has not been convinced that irradiation is for their benefit. And every time they went to bring in irradiated food, to some levels it has been accepted by the consumer, but overall the acceptance is still iffy, and these manufacturers are still concerned as to whether or not it's going to be accepted by the consumer.
So that looks like the best place, and maybe the only place, for consumers to exert their will on this, at the marketplace rather than in the courts or with the government.
Exactly. It's the dollar out of the pocket that is the biggest voice that you and I have as individual private citizens in this matter. I mean, we can go to court, we can go to the government, and you know, that may or may not get us anywhere, but if we refuse to buy the product, that'll get us everywhere.
And do some demonstrating in front of a store that says
there have been demonstrations, that's true, and that scares these merchants because they don't want that.
Well, are there any organizations which people can turn to?
Here in the last few months, this organization known as Food and Water Incorporated, and they're centered in New York City, and they're taking the banner and running with it and doing an excellent job. They're putting out some first-rate material. People who choose to get involved with the organization are kept abreast as to what's going on, and advised and suggested as to what kind of action it might be beneficially employed to curtail the operators from producing irradiated food.
And in Florida, is there anything that's being done, or is that...
Well, the strongest thing that I could recommend at this point in time is for the viewer to get in touch with the Florida Citrus Commission. And that address is available to them. And write to them and let them know their feelings. Will you or will you not buy irradiated citrus? And would you encourage your friends to do so or not? Here again, that dollar out of the pocket's going to have more, stronger voice than you and I can imagine, and it's going to speak eloquently.
Well, I hope so. This sounds like a horrible thing. It's just an excuse to try to justify, continue justification of the nuclear industry and to try to do something with all those wastes that are piling up. They can say, well, the nuclear industry is okay because look at all the good we're doing with this nuclear waste. We're irradiating your food. I mean, don't worry, you know, you look good in green. James, thank you for coming by, and we hope you'll come by with updates ever so often so we can find out what's happening in this.
Well, I asked the people to get in touch with Food and Water, Inc., and they can call a toll-free number, 1-800-EAT-SAFE.
Now, one last bailout story. Well, I think we might have mentioned this just tangentially before, about what's going down next. We've talked about the S&Ls, talked about the big banks and the insurance companies. Well, the Spotlight has an article indicating that the FHA is next, but it won't be till 1996, folks. It'll take a while. But it seems that there's going to be a big bailout required by you and I. They call it the Treasury Department, but we know who that is, you and I. But there's a report issued by the General Accounting Office said that basic FHA management weaknesses caused this, and little can be done to control the ever-increasing drain of reserve from the FHA's insurance fund. Of course, the FHA insures home mortgages. It lost some $1.4 million in fiscal year '88, possibly another $500,000 in fiscal '89, but there's also been alleged corruption involved, too. Now, many economists have predicted the situation will worsen as the government dumps the assets of failed thrift institutions on the market, thereby depressing the values of all these mortgages that people have, and then they default, and who picks up the tab? Well, the FHA does. And there we go again. And that's the end of this Alternative Views. We hear from viewers who request a list of news publications, which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network. P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. You must send a self-addressed stamped envelope. We also can provide you with information on how to get materials which have been disseminated by former CIA officer John Stockwell. We'd like to thank Parallel Films, who let us use a portion of their magnificent documentary by Joan Harvey, America from Hitler to MX. And that's the address of Parallel Films. Also, our crew people, Brian Lynch, Georgia List, Karen Vines, Kevin L. West, and Eric Eubank. Our thanks to them as well. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713. Goodbye.